The expenses page, there are 4 drop-down sections. I will go over each of them, and then we will take a deeper dive. It is extremely important to stay with us through the whole video so you can fully understand what each section does before putting in all your expenses. The first is overhead expenses, which are any expense that are not directly related to a project. Then we have other expenses, which will be used for unique expenses you don't typically find in your general QuickBooks overhead expenses. And the last two are overhead equipment and overhead employees. But you shouldn't have to work on these because they have already been filled out from the work you did in labor and equipment. Now, I need to discuss one last thing before we start filling in this section. The overhead expenses serves 2 purposes in the software. The first is we use these numbers in the Profit Genie to tell you how much you need to charge to make your profit goal at the end of the year. And the second is that it serves as your budget for the year. For instance, if you set your expense for small tools at $1,000 for the year, but end up spending $10,000 on small tools, you will have gone over budget by $9,000. Now, that $9,000 that you went over budget will come straight out of your profit goal for the year. Now, please keep this in mind when setting up all your expenses, because some expenses like a phone bill are set and there's really nothing you can do about them, while other expenses, like small tools, are more on the budgeting side. If you miss too many of these, it really starts to dig into your profits. Whenever you come to a budgetary type expense, we suggest you take some extra time to think about what you have right now, what you ultimately want, and what you will need this coming year. Then set your budget according to that number. All right, let's dive in. Overhead expenses are any costs that aren't directly related to the construction of a project. We're not going to add expenses like dirt, rock, pavers, and sod because those are costs that are directly related to their projects. Overhead expenses are the expenses incurred whether you're doing projects or not, like insurance, advertising, office supplies, utilities and repairs, stuff like that. There's a couple of different ways you can add your overhead expenses. One way, which we do not recommend, is if you already know what your total overhead is each month, you could just add that on one of the lines and be done. Now, this could potentially get you up and running in our software the quickest, but we do not recommend doing it this way for 2 reasons. The first one is because you could be wrong, which will skew all of your numbers for the year. And the second is, as your expenses change year to year or even month to month, it's difficult to keep track of what you've added and subtracted to that one number. This might seem like a daunting task to some people, but it's really not. I personally run a landscape construction company, and my accountant and I sat down and knocked this out in about 2 hours. Now, the overhead expenses section has most of the same categories as your QuickBooks P&L. If you see something missing, you can always add it by clicking the Add New Category button right here. To add an expense, locate the proper category and click the Add Expense button. For instance, if we want to add general liability insurance, we'll locate the Insurance tab, click on the Add Expense button, which will open the sidebar. Enter a name for the expense. For this situation, we'll type in general liability. Now, we've given you a couple of different ways to fill these expenses in. If your general liability is $12,000 for the year and you pay it every 6 months, you could enter $6,000 in January and $6,000 in June, just like this. You know that your general liability is $12,000 and you want to see it as a monthly expense. Simply put $12,000 in January space, then click on the button Fill Evenly with the first number entered. Then click on the Save button to move to the next expense. Now, let's add a phone bill. Locate the Utilities category and click on the Add Expense button. We will name this Cell Phone. And because cell phone bills come monthly, we can put the monthly charge in the January space and click Fill All with the first number entered. Then simply click Save. Continue filling out the overhead expenses until it's completed. Now, I know you're excited to get to the Profit Genie and start building proposals, but this section is extremely important and needs to be filled out accurately for everything else in the software to work. So please take your time, double and triple check your work, because your accuracy here will ensure your success everywhere else in the software. Now that the overhead section is complete, you can fill out any unique expense you want in the other expenses section. This is the area where you can put expenses like commissions, bonuses, food for employees, and most importantly, a miscellaneous expense. When I consult with businesses, I always tell them to add a miscellaneous expense item here in this section. The miscellaneous expense should be a minimum of 5% of your total overall overhead and is intended to cover unforeseen expenses, which we all have throughout the year. In other words, if your overhead is $30,000 per month, you would want to add a minimum of $1,500 up to $3,000 for a miscellaneous expense. These other expenses are added in the exact same way as the overhead expenses section. And remember, whatever money you spend on expenses that are not recorded in these sections will come straight out of your profit at the end of the year. So if you want to pay your employees bonuses or buy them food and you don't want it to come out of your profit, it needs to be budgeted in one of these sections. Okay, once you've completed this entire section, double and triple check and save your work, go ahead and click the next button for the Profit Genie.